In today's episode, we go over 5 shark attack stories involving rare occurrences of the victims being attacked by a pack of sharks. From a family who accidentally drove off a cliff into shark-infested water, to a family on vacation torn apart by a pack of tiger sharks, these stories are some of the most terrifying shark attacks of all time. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. Welcome to Final Affliction. This Wednesday marked the 3rd day of their vacation in the Bahamas. Like many tourists, they had always dreamed of visiting the island country. Unlike most places in the world, the Bahamas wasn't falsely represented by the media and movies. It was, if not more, as stunning and exciting as they said. Jordan and her family woke up to the sunrise, eager to start the day. After all, this was only their 3rd day, and they had so many things to do. Jordan had breakfast with her family and shared stories with them as they sat together at the table. It was a fun time surrounded by the beautiful sandy beaches in the Bahamas and accompanied by her family and her girlfriend. What more could a 21-year-old girl from Torrance, California ask for? Back home, Jordan was studying communications at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Her girlfriend Gianna was also studying communications. At around 12 p.m., the family had just finished their activities and were about to end the day relaxing and enjoying the scenery. However, that would soon change. Spotting the Sandy Toes Tour Company, the family decided to take a last-minute day trip to Rose Island. The 6-hour excursion involved a boat cruise, a snorkeling experience, and a private beach where you could pet swimming pigs. Jordan was ecstatic about the idea. She had always been an admirer of nature and deeply loved animals. Snorkeling and petting pigs in the Bahamas was music to her ears. Although the trip was already full for the day, Michael, Jordan's father, managed to convince the company to have them on board for the excursion. The company snuck them on. Excited at the deal, the family headed towards Paradise Island Ferry Terminal, ready to board the ferry that would take them to Rose Island. It was a tragic mistake. As the energetic family boarded the ferry, they beamed their smiles at each other, unaware of what was about to happen. Nobody could have predicted that this small day trip would change their lives forever. The small ferry was docked, floating atop the rich turquoise waters beneath it. Although it was in the middle of summer, the sun decided to hide effectively today, behind the gray clouds looming over the ocean. Still, the waters were just as beautiful with the dimmer sunshine it was working with. Eventually, the family followed the guide to prepare for their snorkeling excursion. However, Michael, the 2 brothers, Jordan's sister, and Gianna did not want to go through with the snorkeling. They just wanted to spend the rest of the afternoon lightly swimming by the beachside, enjoying the scenic views of the ocean. Jordan and Cammie, on the other hand, wanted the full experience. It was the 3rd day of their trip, after all, and Jordan wanted to make the most of it. The family talked it over and decided they would just part for a while. Later, Jordan and Cammie would rendezvous with Michael and the rest by the beachside. Since the distance to the other side where the snorkeling spot was not so far, separating from one another seemed like a good idea at the time. However, it was a decision that everyone would later regret. As the 2 groups parted ways, Michael kissed Jordan on the forehead and told her, "I'll see you later, Jordan." Jordan waved her hand as she walked with Cammie towards the other part of the beach. The rest of the members left by the beachside waved her goodbye. Unbeknownst to them, this would be the last time they would see Jordan alive. Jordan and Cammie walked up to the guide and followed the trail. The snorkeling spot was not too far, but walking towards it was a great time for reflection. Along the way, there were green vegetation and exotic birds such as peacocks in the area. The trail was sparsely placed with benches, locker rooms, and bathrooms for the tourists. The narrow trail was surrounded by all kinds of trees growing through the sandy soil. Cammie and Jordan spoke about life, her school, and her family as they calmly walked alongside the other tourists. The bright 21-year-old had many aspirations and a great future ahead of her. Eventually, they reached the snorkeling spot. Donning their wetsuits, Jordan and Cammie prepared for the fun experience. Jordan was particularly excited to see the underwater critters meandering around in the area. It was time to go. Jordan headed towards the deeper parts of the water, admiring nature through her goggles. It was great timing as the sunlight began to show itself again, illuminating the beautiful structures of coral reefs under the water. Cammie had also gotten in the water and was thoroughly enjoying her underwater exploration. However, As the two enjoyed their experience, death reared its ugly head. As Jordan continued looking through the water, Cammy broke through the surface. Suddenly, she heard Jordan yell, "Mom!" She turned her head and saw something strange. At first, she thought it was a school of dolphins surrounding Jordan, and that Jordan wanted to show it to her. However, as she looked more intently, an ominous feeling enveloped her. It was a feeling no mother ever wanted to feel. A school of sharks had approached Jordan out of nowhere. Immediately, Cammy's motherly instincts kicked in. She shouted at Jordan from a distance, telling her to swim towards her. However, it was futile. Without warning, the school of sharks pounced on her, biting her everywhere. Jordan fought hard, but there was already blood in the water, and the sharks had become frenzied. Jordan let loose blood-curdling screams, prompting Cammy to approach her. She screamed at Jordan once more, asking her to swim towards her. However, Jordan could not swim anymore. Cammy noticed her right arm had been bitten off by the shark. Horrified at the sight, Cammy immediately sprang into action, swimming towards Jordan despite the risk of getting attacked herself. Naturally, she was fearful of swimming into the chaos, but she didn't care. The fear of losing her child overtook any instinct to run and call for help. It was simply something any loving mother would have done. Cammy reached Jordan and fought off the sharks, punching the beasts in the nose and hitting them with everything she had. As she pulled on Jordan, the young girl told Cammy, "Mom, there's another shark coming." The shark sped towards them like a freight train. It bit off another chunk of her lower leg. Jordan was bleeding profusely. Cammy never gave up. She hauled Jordan toward a nearby rock and called for help. Eventually, a boat from the Sandy Toes snorkeling tour rushed to her aid. Michael and the other family members were petting pigs by the beachside when they heard of a teenager attacked by sharks in the snorkeling area. After waiting a few minutes, Jordan was taken by an ambulance to a hospital in Nassau. However, upon arrival, she was pronounced dead. When Michael and the rest arrived at the hospital, they were too late. Jordan had succumbed to her injuries. In the subsequent months following her death, the family criticized the company for not having any protocols when it came to shark attacks. When the incident happened, not one staff or a boat was present to whisk away the sharks. Additionally, when Jordan was bleeding on a nearby island, barely clinging to life, the boat that would take her to the hospital arrived with no medical supplies. According to Michael, they did not even have first aid. The Lindsays called for better responses in the future to avoid the terrible fate their daughter experienced. Sadly, according to Michael, in his most recent interviews, Cammy is still too traumatized from the incident, especially because she was present and she witnessed firsthand her daughter resting in her arms while slowly succumbing to her final affliction.
It was 1967 in Sydney, Australia. Some friends were heading out for the day. They were a group of 3 adults and 1 child. They climbed into the car, chatting happily as they made their way along Australia's coastline. They drove through Sydney's picturesque eastern suburb of Dover Heights. The road wound along the cliff tops. On this particular day, however, the visibility was poor. The autumn fog had rolled in off the sea, enveloping the coast and the city in a blanket of white. As the car motored along, the child in the back seat began acting up. He had dropped something on the floor and couldn't reach it. In an attempt to calm the child down, the driver tried to reach into the footwell behind him and find the toy. He took his eyes off the road for a second. It was a second that proved fatal. He misjudged his speed at the oncoming corner and veered to the other side of the road. He slammed on his brakes, but it was too late. The car crashed through the safety barrier. The passengers screamed as the car flew through the air for a few seconds before tumbling down the cliff. But it didn't topple into the sea, not straight away. It became caught on some rocks sticking out from the cliff edge. The rocks held the car in a terrifying vertical position. The sudden halt on the rocks sent everyone flying forwards in their seats. The front passenger hurtled forwards. She smashed through the windscreen and fell to the water 100 feet below. Only seconds later did she hit the cold, hard surface of the ocean. She lay still, lifeless on top of the water. Within moments, there were shadowy shapes making a beeline for the woman in the water. They converged from all directions, drawn by the loud splash, drawn by the scent of blood. There was a frenzied attack on the woman's body. Eyewitnesses reported seeing 14 sharks thrashing around in the water as the car hung precariously on the cliff above. If the passenger hadn't died on impact, she was torn to shreds in seconds by the sharks below. The driver could see the commotion in the water. He could see the ocean bubble and boil, turning red as the woman disappeared from sight. He cried out and tried to look behind him to see if the others were alive in the back of the car. The seatbelt bit into his chest. He couldn't loosen it. He couldn't free himself. It was holding him firm, but he needed some slack in order to move. He heard the car creak and groan under the strain. Every time he made the slightest movement, the car rocked and swayed. It was hanging on by inches. When the driver glanced over his shoulder, he could see the child and the other passenger were not moving. He tried to reach them, desperately trying to wake them, but they didn't respond. He didn't know what to do. If he somehow managed to climb out of the car, he was still stuck on a sheer cliff 100 feet above the sea. People rushed to the cliff top. As the car hung there, emergency services were called. The man had hit his head badly on the steering wheel. His vision was blurry and his head was oozing blood. He could feel it throbbing. The pounding of his heart sounded in his ears. Terror gripped him as he prayed for a miracle. But after 30 minutes, clinging onto the edge of the cliff, the rocks finally gave way. The car and the driver were sent flying. The car crashed downwards, somersaulting down the cliff. It smashed into the water below and bobbed there for a few minutes. The man felt the rush of water entering the vehicle. He desperately pulled at his seatbelt, but it wouldn't unclip. As the water kept rising, he panicked more and more. He felt it creep up over his feet and onto his lap. He was now sitting in waist-high water. Then something swept past his side, just outside the window. A dark gray fin sliced through the water. Then another and another. The man was surrounded. The sharks had gotten a taste for human flesh and they were hungry for more. Frantically, the man tugged at the seatbelt. Eventually, he was able to ease the tension and unclip it. The car was now half submerged. There was no way out except to dive under the water and swim out through the half-smashed windscreen. But he knew what was down there. The thought shook him to his core. He knew the second he exited the car, he would likely be devoured. He heard thrashing and splashing around him. He wheeled around. The sharks were trying to get through the smashed back windows. They were trying to get to the two passengers in the back seats. He had to get out of there. He had to act fast. He took one deep breath near the roof of the car and dived underwater. The blurry, shadowy figures of the sharks came into view as they swam past the open windscreen. He watched as they swam from left to right and back again, circling the vehicle, looking for a way in. When he could see no sharks in front of him, he chose this moment to go for it. He pushed off the driver's seat with his feet and swam through the smashed windscreen. The blood from the gaping wound on his head flowed into the water. The scent enticed the sharks. They homed in on the injured prey. When he surfaced, he scrambled onto the roof of the car. It was barely above water now. It was wet and slippery, but he clung on, hauling himself onto the steel top. He steadied himself there for a moment, breathing heavily. Blood dripped into his eyes. He wiped it away and looked at the shore. It was tantalizingly close. All around him, dorsal fins broke through the surface of the water. They were having a feeding frenzy. They had found their way into the car now and had made their way into the back seats. As the car gurgled and rocked and the tail fins of the sharks thrashed and splashed, the man knew he had to make a break for it. In just seconds, he knew the car would be at the bottom of the harbor and he would be eaten. Summoning all the courage he could muster, he dived from the roof of the car towards the shoreline. It was only feet away. He knew the sharks would be on him instantly. He hurtled through the water, kicking his legs frantically, pulling himself through the water with his arms, inching closer and closer to the shore. It felt like an eternity. His lungs felt like they were going to burst. His muscles burned. He was convinced with every second that passed that he would be attacked. He was sure he would suddenly feel a sharp bite as one of the sharks grabbed him and shook him around briefly. But miraculously, he made it to shore. He grabbed hold of the rocks and scrambled onto dry land. When he made it, he looked around just in time to see the car sink. The swirling and the bubbling of the water was all that was left as it swallowed the car. The thrashing and splashing of the sharks continued for some time as they followed the car downwards. When emergency services reached the man, he was taken to hospital. He had a serious head and neck injury and was also treated for shock. But luckily, he went on to make a full recovery. He lost his friends that day in a tragic and terrifying event that would haunt him for the rest of his days. There had been a lot of reported shark attacks in Sydney Harbor and its surrounding beaches over the decades. The exact species of shark involved was never identified and remains unknown, although marine biologists theorize that this might be the work of the bull shark since they occasionally hunt in groups called schools. What we must remember is that the moment we step into the water, we are in their domain, not ours, and at any moment we might just meet our untimely, final affliction. Great white sharks have been portrayed as the most ferocious and dangerous creatures in the ocean ever since the release of Jaws in 1975. But what if instead of one shark haunting the waters, two or even more were working together as a group? Sharks are much older than dinosaurs. Their ancestry dates back more than 400 million years, and they're one of evolution's greatest success stories. The torpedo shape of the great white is built for speeds up to 35 miles per hour, and there are teeth, 300 total in up to 7 rows. But more than its brawn, the great white shark has a tremendous brain that coordinates all the highly developed senses of the sufficient hunter. Its prey, including seals and dolphins, are very clever animals, and the shark has to have enough brains to outsmart them. Despite their reputation as lone hunters, there is now significant Mexican research showing that great white sharks will cooperate with one another, hunting in groups and sharing the spoils. Scientists say research of Mexico's Guadalupe Island in the Pacific Ocean shows great white sharks are sociable and will sometimes work together to increase their chances of catching prey. A team of scientists from Florida International University created a social tag tracking device to put on the great white sharks. With a video camera and sensors detecting the shark's acceleration, depth, and direction, the device also has receivers to detect when other sharks are near them. The team then put devices on various male and female white sharks over a 4-year period. The data showed that instead of being lone hunters, sharks preferred to be in and hunt in groups of the same sex. However, their ways of hunting were unique. They would take turns patrolling smaller prey like seal colonies, but when it came to hunting larger prey, they would often hunt in groups, working together to take down its prey. Scientists proposed that white sharks would even share information on the location of the remains of large prey with other sharks, with research confirming that great whites tend to hunt smaller prey like seals individually, and with most attacks on humans being mistaken identity to that of a seal, it only makes sense that most shark attacks are the work of a single shark. Despite the overwhelming majority of great white shark attacks on humans being the work of a lone attacker, the brutal attack in today's story is an example of a group of 8 great white sharks working together to hunt and kill 3 young boys. 16-year-old Raymond Perez and his 2 best friends, Manuel Garcia and Carlos Diaz from Rio Jaina, Dominican Republic, did everything together. They'd grown up together since babies, and the group of 3 were inseparable. On August 12, 1963, the 3 boys were enjoying the last bit of their summer vacation, swimming off the breakwater in the port of Rio Jaina. Breakwaters are designed primarily to protect ports from the rough seas. Commonly made out of rocks, they often enticed swimmers to walk along them or swim next to them while unaware of the dangers. Climbing on breakwaters often results in falling due to how slippery they become with the constant waves splashing over them. People who climb the breakwaters often cut their feet on mussels and other sea life that form on the rocks submerged in the water. The sea around the breakwater often forms riptides and strong currents that could drown unsuspecting swimmers. Or in the case of Raymond and his 2 friends, swimmers can be slammed up against the rocks of the breakwater, resulting in serious injury or worse. It was unusually hot on the fateful day the boys arrived at Port Rio Jaina. The thought of sitting on the breakwater and dipping their feet in the water was just too tempting for the boys to ignore. And so, within a few minutes, they found themselves climbing on the slippery rock wall of the breakwater. They'd been to this exact location several times before and witnessed massive waves crashing against the rocks. But on this beautiful day, the water was calm, and so they decided to jump in beside the wall. They took turns jumping off the breakwater into the sea, diving to the bottom and having fun cooling off in the water. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, dark clouds rolled in over the boys and the water started to become choppy and rough. Within a minute, fierce waves began to throw the boys against the wall of the breakwater before sweeping them back into the ocean, only to be thrown against the rocks again by the ever-increasing force of the water. As the boys were propelled onto the rocks, Carlos managed to grab onto the wall and escape, while Raymond and Manuel were yet again swept back into the sea by the currents. Carlos stood on the rocks, waiting for the waves to force his friends onto the wall again, where he could grab hold of them and help them to safety. However, as the water slammed down onto the rocks, it swept Carlos off his feet and into the water once again. His arm had a strange burning sensation, and upon checking it, he noticed his arm was severely cut open and bleeding from falling on the rocks. Manuel had also severely cut his upper right thigh upon being thrown onto the rocks by the waves, making it hard for him to swim and stay afloat in the rough waters. Miraculously, Raymond was able to latch onto the rocks on the wall and pull himself out of the water to safety. But the current swept his 2 friends hundreds of feet into the sea away from the shore. All Raymond could do was hang on to the rocks for dear life as the waves crashed down on top of him, watching as his 2 friends struggled to swim back to shore. They'd both been injured and were bleeding from their wounds received from being thrown by the sea against the breakwater. As they tried to swim back to shore, their movements were not smooth and continuous, and they became very desperate and fearful they might drown before making it back to shore. Little did they know that drowning was the least of their worries. As the 2 boys struggled to swim back to shore, Manuel felt something large bump against his hip bone right above the cut on his thigh. He immediately started thrashing around and trying to feel around for whatever just bumped him under the water. His heart sank in his chest as Carlos alerted him of several shark fins breaking the surface close by. Sharks can smell blood from hundreds of meters away in concentrations as low as 1 part per million, and the 2 boys were bleeding excessively from their wounds, alerting a pack of great white sharks to the area for an easy meal. Sharks also have an acute sense of hearing and are sensitive to low-frequency signals. They're able to track sounds and are particularly attracted to sounds made by wounded prey, especially the sound of thrashing in the water. the exact sound that Carlos and Manuel were making as they were desperately trying to swim back to the shore while injured. The boys began to hear Raymond yelling from the breakwater, warning them of the sharks, telling them to swim as fast as they could to the shore. All of a sudden, Manuel screams in fear as he feels another bump from under the water, this time with enough force to lift him partially out of the water. As Carlos swam over to Manuel to calm him down, suddenly Manuel was launched completely out of the water into the air. Still in midair, a second shark came torpedoing out of the water like a rocket, chomping Manuel's belly in its jaws before crashing down into the water beside Carlos. This was witnessed by several onlookers on the beach who immediately began looking for help. Carlos began to swim in fear as fast as he could towards the shore. The pain from his injuries was now seemingly gone, with all the adrenaline surging through his body. He could see several dorsal fins break the surface in the distance in front of him before dipping back down under the water, but he had no choice but to keep swimming towards the shore. One of the onlookers who witnessed Manuel's brutal death was the owner of a small boat at the port, who immediately rushed towards Carlos to save him from the sharks. As he got within 20 feet of Carlos, the jaws of the massive great white shark opened up from the side of Carlos and bit down on his right arm and shoulder and began shaking violently. Carlos let out screams of pain when seconds later another shark surfaced from his other side and clamped down on his left arm and head, muffling his screams before taking him beneath the water. All that remained when the boat finally arrived was a pool of red blood in the water. The rescue boat stayed idle, hoping that Carlos would resurface, allowing for another chance to save him, but he never did. Both Carlos and Manuel were tragically never seen again. No remains ever washed up on the shore, and it was apparent that the pack of sharks devoured every last bit of the two 16-year-old boys. Raymond was later recovered from the breakwall and made a full recovery, but this terrifying event prevented him from ever entering the waters in the Dominican Republic ever again. Out of the 3 witnesses on the shore that day, as well as Manuel, there's been conflicting reports about the amount of sharks in the water and what happened during the attack that day. Some witnesses say that the boys had already drowned from their injuries before the sharks attacked them, while others distinctly remember seeing the 2 boys alive, desperately trying to escape. Also, the amount of sharks spotted in the water that day ranged from 5 to 8, and we'll never know exactly how many sharks were part of this man-eating deadly pack. The following story not only showcases the power of human resilience and perseverance in the face of unfathomable tragedy, but also highlights the highly unpredictable nature and mysterious behavior of sharks. On October 14, 1972, 3 men by the names of Brett Gillian, Rob Temple, and Robbie McIlvaine were on a scientific expedition to recover samples for a research project being conducted at Cane Bay on the island of St. Croix, North Shore. Gillian described the area as having some of the best wall diving locations in the Eastern Caribbean. Even the drop-off was fairly easy, not requiring a long boat trip. The team's goal was to collect some photographs and check on traps they had set for a project. The only problem was their destination was situated on a 210-foot wall that was right next to a steep drop-off. The trio was not particularly worried, though, not in the slightest, as they were each veterans of hundreds of deep dives. Rod served as a dive leader and timekeeper. He documented the dives and monitored ascent times to ensure everyone remained safe, while Brett and Robbie handled most of the heavy lifting. All 3 of them donned their gear and dove into the ocean, beginning what would become their ill-fated journey down the Cane Bay Wall. After reaching their destination, Brett and Robbie got to work, while Rod scanned the surroundings. As he was looking around, Rod caught a glimpse of something truly terrifying. It was the sight of 2 white-tipped sharks off in the distance. One was 12 feet long, and the other was marginally bigger. The oceanic white-tipped shark is a truly terrifying creature that mainly inhabits tropical and warm temperate seas. It is most notable for its long, white-tipped, rounded fins. According to recent studies, the species is becoming less common as a result of a strong demand for its enormous fins, which constitute the main component of shark fin soup. It favors eating gastropods, crabs, birds, stingrays, sea turtles, and threadfin. However, this hunter will pretty much eat anything, humans included. Though slow-moving, oceanic white-tip sharks are without question highly dangerous to humans. They are especially known for numerous attacks on survivors of ship and plane wrecks at sea. They are also suspected to be responsible for several unrecorded human fatalities. To give you an idea of just how vicious it is, the white-tip was the major species involved in what many people considered to be one of the worst mass shark attacks ever documented, ripping and mauling many of the USS Indianapolis's surviving crew after it was blown up back in 1945. It's estimated that the white-tip sharks are responsible for up to 150 deaths in that single incident alone. After finishing the required observations, the three men noticed they were ahead of schedule and felt ecstatic, as this meant they would only need about 20 minutes of decompression time, meaning they wouldn't have to linger for too long around the sharks during their ascent. Brett later stated, "I remember thinking how strange it was to see oceanic whitetips right here on the wall at Kane Bay. It was kind of like walking off your back porch and seeing an African lion when you expected an alley cat." Robbie went up first and pointed out the sharks again as they swam by them. The crew were no strangers to these sharks, as they had their fair share of nasty encounters with whitetips when they worked offshore. The shark would frequently bite their equipment, the steel cables deployed from the research vessel, and even the shafts and propellers were targeted on occasion. These two sharks, however, looked to be unique in some way, as they didn't seem to pay any attention to them. As Brett turned around and began the ascent behind Robbie, Rod stayed behind, as their carefully planned dive dictated he would be last to ascend. Brett met up with Robbie at about 175 feet, just over the ledge, as they both rested on a coral while waiting for Rod to join them. However, they soon began to worry as he was growing late. Robbie looked at Brett and pointed to his pressure gauge, which showed he was beginning to run low on air. Suddenly, Rob noticed a mass of bubble exhaust coming from the deeper water, which indicated Rod's presence down below. The two figured that Rod must have had some sort of air failure. Since Brett's air consumption was lower, he decided to send Robbie up while he went to check on Rod to see if he needed help. However, when Brett reached Rod, things were about as bad as they could get. One of the sharks had bitten him on the left thigh without warning, and blood was gushing in red clouds from the wound. Brett was horrified and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Rod was desperately trying to beat the 12-foot animal off his leg and keep from sinking deeper. Brett sprung to his friend's aid, grabbing his right shoulder harness strap and pulling with all the strength. Almost simultaneously, the second shark struck Rod in the same leg and bit him savagely. Rod desperately gouged at the shark's eyes and gills as he grimly fought to beat off his attackers. In a desperate attempt to ward off his friend's attackers, Brett punched at the torso of the hungry beasts as they tore great chunks of flesh from his friend's body. The two men continued their assault on the sharks as they seemed to squirm in pain, suddenly letting go of Rod and retreating back down to deeper waters. Desperate to reach safety, Brett looked up and caught a glimpse of Robbie, who was about 100 feet above, watching in horror. In less than 15 seconds, the first shark returned and struck Rod again, dragging both him and Brett over the drop-off. The attack had only lasted a minute at this point, but Rod had lost a huge amount of blood and tissue and had gone almost completely limp as a result. Brett was clutching Rod's right harness strap as the second shark came back as well. The shark bit down and hung on as the two plummeted down the side of the wall. Brett and Rod were dropping rapidly. His efforts to swim back up were fruitless as the sharks continued to bite and tear Rod's helpless body, all the while dragging the two men deeper and deeper. Brett felt Rod move again to fend off another attack, and his hopes soared upon realizing that his friend was still alive. Brett clung briefly to the edge of the drop-off wall, putting a stop to their rapid descent. Suddenly, both sharks retreated once again, and Brett watched them circle their position about 10 feet away. Brett saw one of the sharks swallow the remains of Rod's lower left leg, while the other gulped a mouthful of flesh it had bitten and torn off. Rod, who was only half conscious by now, looked up at his friend for the first time since the vicious assault began. He shook his head lightly and in pain, then tried to push Brett away, hoping to spare Brett's life and buy him some time to make his escape. Brett grabbed for Rod's waist harness as he felt his hands sink into his friend's now mutilated torso. Sadly, there was no harness left to reach for. Rod had been disemboweled. Brett took off to the surface with Rod clutched to his chest. Immediately, the sharks were on them again. Rod screamed for the last time as the second shark seized him by his midsection and shook him. The blue water turned red with bits of human tissues and blood. Brett was powerless as poor Rod was torn away from him. He watched in utter disbelief as Rod's lifeless body drifted into the abyss, with the sharks fighting over him. The attack had started around 200 feet. Brett's depth gauge was pegged at 325 feet, but he knew it was far deeper than that. Brett also nearly completely depleted his oxygen supply in a hopeless effort to make it out. Brett looked away from his friend's mangled body in what must have been his final goodbye before beginning his ascent towards the surface. His oxygen-starved brain was beginning to give out and the effects of hypoxia were beginning to show. Before he could reach the surface, Brett would drift into unconsciousness, but miraculously woke up on the surface gasping for air. Apparently, the small volume of air in his safety vest he wore had been enough to float him the rest of the way up and save his life. But his survival was still a 1 in a million chance as he had to deal with an unknown amount of emitted decompression. Nonetheless, Brett began swimming to shore as fast as he could, but he felt his legs going numb. By the time he reached the beach, he could barely stand. A couple on their honeymoon had chanced upon Brett's body as it drifted onto the beach. In an incredible burst of good fortune, it turned out the wife was an ER nurse who understood the pathology of decompression sickness. 2 days later, Brett was released from the hospital. He had astonishingly managed to survive ascending almost 400 feet without any decompression sequence, but not without permanent side effects. There was residual numbness in both his arms and legs, along with substantial hearing loss and legal blindness in his right eye that will persist with him for the rest of his life. Robbie's last view of Rod and Brett were as the two were dragged over the wall in a cloud of blood by the sharks. He never saw Brett's ascent and so reported them both killed when he got to shore. It wasn't until Brett called his dad from the hospital that he knew Brett survived. A week later, Rod's memorial service was attended by his two friends at the beach. His body was never recovered. People are often too busy with their lives to take a step back and really think about the important things. Many people die without ever truly living, so it's best not to take life for granted. Just like Rod, you never truly know if tomorrow will be your last day on Earth, the day you finally come to terms with your final affliction.
Most people know that if they're going to go for a swim in Australia, they will need to keep an eye out for a number of animals that might be waiting for its next meal. There are particular species to be careful of, namely the tiger shark, great white shark, and the bull shark. These three species are responsible for 96% of all unprovoked and fatal attacks in Australia, so people know to avoid areas where they are likely to be and follow precautions to avoid ever meeting any of these animals. Unfortunately, accidents can happen, and people can find themselves in situations from which there is no escape, as Sarah Wiley came to discover in 2006 when she was surrounded by hungry bull sharks. In 2006, 21-year-old Sarah Wiley decided to go on a swimming trip with some friends from church. She had always been a particularly devoted girl that made her parents proud as she worked towards becoming an occupational therapist. That weekend, they all chose to visit Amity Point Beach, as they had visited several times in the past and knew the waters quite well. They enjoyed swimming further than most people would dare, feeling exhilarated by the idea of a sheer drop right below them, and the extreme depths only exciting them more. They regularly swam out into the Rainbow Channel, which allowed them to be alone in the water. But today, they planned to stick a little closer to shore. It had been quite stormy recently, so the sea was churned up with sand and debris, causing it to be more murky and intimidating than usual. But the girls weren't scared. However, they should have been. Little did the girls know, they were swimming directly into a hot spot for hungry sharks. Due to the stormy weather, there had been a lot of freshwater runoff, which had increased the amount of water. This all resulted in the drop-off from the sandbank being much steeper than usual, meaning that sharks would be attracted there to hunt. The place that they had decided to explore was also popular with fishermen, who were in the process of throwing the remains of their catches into the water, with blood and guts enticing the sharks to come and feed. Drumlines were also placed around the Rainbow Channel, a method used to lure sharks away from crowded swimming areas using bait attached to hooks like a giant fishing pole, potentially trapping dangerous sharks around the drum lines and attracting other with the bait. The group decided to start swimming in the early evening, hoping to catch the sunset as they swam around. The beach was relatively empty, with only a few families playing in the sand with their children. They were sticking mostly to the shallows, but after some time decided to adventure out a bit further. Sarah swam out with 3 others about 15 meters from the shoreline. They continued to swim and chat out there for a while, carefully treading water to keep themselves above the choppy waves. The water was still pretty clear, and they could see far beneath them, marveling at the fish swimming below them. After some time, Sarah decided she wanted to go even further. They could see a pod of dolphins far in the distance, and she wanted to see how close she could get to them, hoping they would swim closer to her. She swam out into the deeper waters of the Rainbow Channel, right past the drum lines and into darker waters. Sarah got about 5 meters away from her friends and intended to keep going when she was suddenly pulled underwater. Sarah felt the pain in her leg before she realized that she was no longer able to breathe. It was a deep, searing pain that took away any ability to process anything else that was happening. She tried to push off whatever was biting her and causing the pain, but it was too strong. She tried punching it, and that's when she felt another, even worse pain in her arm. As she tried to move her arm away from the pain, she realized part of it was gone. She was in survival mode, with one shark attached to her leg and another trying to pull her apart, one limb at a time. She punched out with her remaining arm, and the same pain greeted her as the shark clamped down on it as well. Her leg was suddenly released, and she somehow made it back to the surface, her blood surrounding her and making it difficult to see anything else. She was fading from consciousness fast, but managed to shout out one thing that she knew would get the attention of her friends. "Shark!" They turned to look at her, thinking she was joking, but when they saw the blood gushing from where her arms should be and the look of terror on their friend's face, they knew that something awful had happened. Josiah Topoyu heard the screams from the beach and leapt into action. He had been spending the day with his wife and 5 children on the beach, but when he heard Sarah's distress, he knew something was wrong. Even if she was joking about the sharks, her screams portrayed genuine fear and that she needed saving. Without thinking, Josiah ran into the shark-infested waters and swam as fast as he could to the young woman. He had never faced a shark before, but he had heard of people kicking and punching sharks to get them away, So that was his plan. He just needed to get to her before the sharks came back to finish her off. The water got redder as he approached Sarah, who was barely able to keep her head above the water at this point. He scanned the area and couldn't see any sharks, but could see the injuries that they had inflicted on poor Sarah. He grabbed her and started to swim back to shore, taking extra care to keep her head above water, as she was slowly losing the ability to do so herself. He worried that she would drown before he got her to shore. He had to swim 15 meters back to safety, Sarah's blood surrounding both of them and pouring out of her body at an alarming rate. All Josiah could think about was how her blood was going to attract the sharks back to both of them. What happened instead was like something out of a Disney movie. The dolphins that Sarah had swam out to sea had surrounded them, protecting them from the surrounding sharks. The dolphins had created a barrier that the sharks couldn't pass. After a harrowingly long swim, they made it back to the beach and Josiah dragged her from the water. Sarah was now safe from the sharks, but her injuries still threatened her life. The people on the beach immediately wrapped Sarah's wounds, trying to stem the blood flow as it gushed from her arms. They could see how severe her wounds were. The sharks had bitten off her hands and left massive gaping wounds on her right thigh and torso. All they could do was keep talking to her to try and keep her conscious, but she was slipping away fast, the whole ordeal quickly taking its toll on her body. She was carried away by stretcher, the emergency workers struggling against the fine sand as it gave way beneath their feet. When they finally reached their vehicle, they drove her for 2 kilometers to the local hospital. Unfortunately, upon arrival, they lacked the proper equipment to save her life and called for a helicopter to relocate her to Brisbane's Princess Alexandra Hospital. Although she reached the hospital within an hour of her attack, she had already lost too much blood. Sadly, Sarah died at the hospital from hypovolemic shock. While Josiah was hailed as a hero who risked his life to save a stranger, others began the hunt for the sharks responsible. It was determined that Sarah had been attacked by multiple bull sharks. In the summer seasons, this species would often hunt in packs. They were prevalent in the Rainbow Channel, and the drumlines had been set up specifically to catch bull sharks. Specialists agreed that it was most likely the bull shark, as they are particularly aggressive and are likely to patrol shallow areas to find their prey. It was determined that the drumlines had not protected the area as it was meant to, although swimmers were also not meant to swim out as far as Sarah did. Either way, a search for the sharks was started, but nothing was found. All that was left was for Sarah's family to put their child to rest. Josiah received a medal for bravery from Queensland Governor Quentin Bryce and still remembers the tragic event like it was yesterday. He is sure that she fought bravely, which is why her hands were severed by the sharks, and she had tried with all her might to survive. To honor her, Josiah named his 6th child Sarah, in memory of the Sarah that God took away. Bull sharks are generally solitary hunters and don't typically hunt in packs. However, it is not uncommon for multiple bull sharks to be found in the same area, particularly in areas with abundant food sources. In these kinds of scenarios, they may compete with each other for food and attack the same prey, but they don't hunt cooperatively with each other like wolves or lions. However, humans being attacked by multiple sharks simultaneously does occasionally happen, increasing the odds of the victim meeting their unfortunate final affliction.